the snow and the silence. The snow was falling again that night, the kind of snow that seemed to muffle the whole city, swallowing the sound of traffic, softening the glow of neon lights, making even the busiest streets look abandoned. Winter in the city always had a way of dividing people. Those with warm houses and glowing fireplaces hurried inside, shutting the cold out, while those with nothing were left under bridges, on benches, or huddled near subway grates for a little warmth. To most passers-by, the sight of someone lying on a bench with a coat pulled tightly around them was no longer shocking. It had become part of the landscape, something people looked past. But for Edward Sterling, that night would be different. Though he didn't know it yet, Edward Sterling was a man the city knew by name, though not by face. His name was stamped across the glass towers his company had built, across the foundations of charities he had sponsored, across deals signed in marble boardrooms where fortunes were made and destroyed with the flick of a pen. He was a millionaire, but not the glamorous kind people saw on magazine covers. Edward was serious, efficient, a man of numbers more than people. He believed in systems, rules, and efficiency above all else. He was the type who measured a person's worth by how well they performed a task, how quietly they served, how rarely they made mistakes. For years he had built his empire on these principles, and in return, he gained wealth that most could not even imagine. What he lost along the way, however, was something he never paused to calculate: his ability to see people as more than pieces of a system. Among the people who worked in his large stone mansion at the edge of the city was a woman named Maria Lopez. She was quiet, always present before sunrise, always moving softly through the halls in her navy blue uniform, keeping the house in order without ever drawing attention to herself. She made sure his tea was steeped at exactly 6 minutes. She polished the marble floors so they shone like water. She folded his shirts in perfect squares, never a wrinkle out of place. To Edward, Maria was efficient. She was invisible. She was part of the machinery of his well-controlled life. He never asked her about her family, her life outside, or her dreams. He never noticed the tiredness under her eyes or the way her hands sometimes trembled when she thought no one was watching. She was the maid, and that was all. Until the day she was 5 minutes late. Edward had a strict rule: lateness was disrespect. That Friday morning, when Maria arrived a few minutes after her time, snow melting in her hair, eyes red as if she hadn't slept, Edward looked up from his newspaper with irritation. He didn't ask why. He didn't care to. He only said, "You're dismissed." His voice was flat, his eyes cold. Maria didn't argue, didn't plead, didn't try to explain. She only nodded, lowered her head, and quietly walked out of the mansion. Edward never thought about her again that day. He didn't know she had been sleeping in the broom closet for months because she had nowhere else to go. He didn't know she had been sending nearly all her wages to a sick daughter back home. He didn't know that when he fired her, she didn't even have enough money left to pay for a bus ride, let alone rent. He didn't know that she wandered through the city that night with thin shoes and a uniform, searching for a place to rest but finding every shelter full. That evening, Maria sat on a cold bench in a small park near the financial district, her arms folded across her chest, her body shivering so hard she could barely keep her eyes open. The snow piled around her, covering her apron in white. She told herself she would just rest her eyes for a moment, but exhaustion was cruel, and the cold was even crueler. By the time morning light touched the city, Maria's breathing was shallow, her body weak, her hands stiff as ice. She didn't know if she would ever wake again. That same morning, Edward Sterling found himself unusually delayed. His driver was late, caught in the heavy snow, and Edward had a board meeting to attend. Impatient, he pulled on his heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and decided to walk the few blocks through the park to the building where his meeting was held. Snow crunched beneath his polished shoes as he cut across the path. His mind was already occupied with numbers, projections, the rise and fall of markets. He thought about profits, about expansion, about mergers and contracts. His thoughts were far from anything human until he saw her. At first, she was just a shape on a bench half buried in snow, a figure most people would pass by without a second look. But something about the navy blue fabric beneath the frost caught his eye. It looked familiar. He slowed his steps, squinting through the morning haze. The woman's head was tilted to one side, her lips slightly parted, her skin pale. She looked small, fragile, almost lifeless. Edward's heart gave a strange, uneasy skip. He stepped closer, brushing snow from her shoulder, and then froze. It was Maria. For a long moment, he simply stared. He could not connect the woman before him with the quiet figure who had polished his floors and folded his clothes. This wasn't how she was supposed to look, helpless, freezing, abandoned. He reached out and touched her arm. The shock of her skin, icy and stiff, jolted him like electricity. "Maria," he said quickly, his voice unsteady. She didn't move. He shook her gently, his breath visible in the cold air. "Maria, wake up." Still, she didn't respond. Panic rose in his chest, deeper and sharper than the kind he felt when business deals collapsed or stocks dropped. This was different. This was raw. He fumbled for his phone, hands shaking as he dialed emergency services. His eyes never left her face, dusted with snow, lips trembling slightly even in unconsciousness. She looked so small, so breakable, and suddenly Edward was struck by a wave of realization. He had never noticed her humanity before. She had been right in front of him every day, but he had treated her as invisible. Now here she was slipping away before his eyes, and he could not bear it. When the sirens finally wailed through the quiet park, Edward was still crouched beside her, brushing snow from her clothes, whispering her name, begging her to hold on. He didn't care that his suit was wet, that his shoes were ruined, that his meeting would be missed. For the first time in his life, the numbers, the contracts, the empires he had built meant nothing. All that mattered was Maria, the maid he had never seen until this moment. As the paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher, Edward followed without hesitation. He climbed into the back of the ambulance, ignoring the startled look of the medic. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched, his mind reeling. For the first time in years, Edward Sterling wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about the woman he had cast out into the cold, and somewhere deep inside something began to crack. The hospital and the awakening. The ambulance rattled through the snow-covered streets, its siren wailing like a desperate cry cutting through the frozen air. Edward Sterling sat pressed against the cold metal wall inside, his eyes fixed on the woman lying on the stretcher. Maria looked even smaller under the harsh fluorescent light of the vehicle, her cheeks drained of color, her lips blue, her chest rising and falling with mechanical rhythm as the paramedics worked. Her hair was damp from the snow, strands clinging to her forehead, and her uniform clung to her thin frame like it belonged to another world. Edward had sat in boardrooms with men who could move nations with their money, had stared at contracts worth billions, had seen storms of numbers fill screens in markets across the globe. But he had never felt so helpless in his entire life. His hand twitched at his side as if he wanted to reach for her, but he stopped, his own pride still weighing him down. One of the paramedics glanced at him with suspicion, clearly trying to understand why a man in an expensive suit was sitting beside a woman in a faded maid's uniform. "Are you family?" the medic asked curtly, pressing a mask over Maria's face as another checked her vitals. Edward hesitated, his throat tight. He wanted to say yes, but the word stuck like a lie. He wasn't family. He wasn't even a friend. He was her employer, the man who had cast her out of his house without a second thought. And yet, sitting here watching her body struggle against the cold, he realized that answer was no longer enough. I'm responsible," Edward finally said, his voice low but steady. The paramedic frowned but asked no further questions. When they reached the hospital, Edward stepped out into the blinding white light of the emergency bay, snow swirling around his coat. He followed the stretcher inside, ignoring the stares of nurses and orderlies, ignoring the loudspeaker calls echoing through the halls. The smell of antiseptic, the hum of machines, the echo of hurried footsteps, all of it faded behind the single image of Maria being wheeled away through double doors. A nurse told him to wait outside, but Edward found himself rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the swinging doors long after they had closed. He sank into one of the hard plastic chairs in the waiting area, his mind spinning. For the first time in years, Edward's phone buzzed unanswered. Messages from his assistant flashed on the screen. Board meeting in 15 minutes. Investors. Waiting. Do you want me to delay? He didn't even look. He sat with his elbows on his knees, his fingers pressed against his temples, trying to steady the storm inside him. Images of Maria drifted through his mind, not as she was now, but as she had been in his home, the way she always kept the fireplace burning before he came down in the morning, the way she cleaned quietly, almost invisibly, as if afraid to disturb his world. The way she once lingered for a moment at the kitchen window when the flowers outside began to bloom, her lips curving into the faintest smile before she returned to work. He had never thought about it then, but now those fragments haunted him. Hours passed. Edward didn't move. He didn't answer his phone. He didn't even notice the coffee cooling untouched beside him. When a doctor finally stepped out, pulling down a mask, Edward rose so quickly that the chair behind him tipped backward with a clatter. "She's stable for now," the doctor said, his tone cautious. "Severe hypothermia. If she had been out there another hour, she wouldn't have survived. We're monitoring her closely." Edward's chest tightened, a wave of relief mixed with shame washing over him. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice raw. The doctor studied him, measuring, then nodded slowly. The hospital room was dim, lit only by the pale glow of monitors and the soft beeping of machines. Maria lay beneath white sheets, her skin warmer now but still pale, her breathing shallow but steady. An oxygen mask covered her mouth, IV tubes ran into her arm, and the sight of her so fragile made Edward's throat ache. He sat down beside her bed, clasping his hands tightly in his lap, and for the first time in his carefully measured life he didn't know what to do. He had always believed in control, in predicting outcomes, in setting rules, in making systems work like clockwork. But this was chaos he couldn't fix with money or orders. He stared at her for a long time, his thoughts heavy. He remembered the way she left his mansion, her head bowed, her hands trembling, her silence dignified even in dismissal. She hadn't pleaded. She hadn't begged. She had simply accepted his judgment as if she had no choice. He realized now that she hadn't just walked out of his house. She had walked out of the last safe place she had, and he had taken even that from her. By midnight, Edward was still there. Nurses came and went, adjusting tubes, checking vitals, but he didn't move. His suit was wrinkled, his hair damp from melted snow, his eyes bloodshot. At one point, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his daughter, Lily. "Dad, are you okay? People are saying you missed the board meeting. Are you having a breakdown?" He stared at the screen, then put the phone face down. For once, he didn't care what the world thought. It was close to dawn when Maria stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, her lips parted under the oxygen mask, and Edward leaned forward so quickly his chair squeaked against the floor. "Maria," he whispered, almost afraid to break the silence. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused, clouded with confusion. She blinked, tried to speak, her voice a dry whisper beneath the mask. Am I dead?" Edward swallowed hard, almost laughing from the ache in his chest. "No," he said softly. "You're alive. You're safe." Her brows furrowed, as her eyes sharpened, focusing on him. For a moment she flinched as if startled by his presence. Her lips trembled. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice weak, laced with suspicion. The question cut deeper than he expected. Why was he here? He could have left after calling the ambulance, could have returned to his empire and let the world go on as usual. But he hadn't. He had stayed, rooted by something he couldn't explain. His voice was low when he finally answered. "Because I should have been here long before today." Maria's eyes filled with tears, which she quickly turned away to hide. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I didn't steal. I didn't lie. I was never late until that day." Edward closed his eyes, shame pressing against his chest like a weight. "And I never asked why," he said quietly. "That's my shame, not yours." Silence filled the room after that, broken only by the steady beep of the monitor. Maria turned her face toward the wall, her shoulders trembling. Edward didn't speak again. He simply sat there watching her breathe, realizing for the first time in his life that wealth meant nothing if he could let someone freeze to death under his watch. When morning finally came, Edward rose, his back stiff, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He left the hospital not to escape, but with a mission already burning in his chest. He had built towers of glass and steel, empires of wealth and power, but he had failed to see a woman suffering right under his roof. That failure had nearly killed her. Now, for the first time in his life, he felt a pull stronger than profit, stronger than ambition. He was going to make it right. He didn't yet know how, but he knew this: his life would never return to what it was before that snowy night. The truth about her life: the day after Maria awoke in the hospital, the city carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Cars rushed through salted streets, businessmen hurried into towers of glass, and ordinary people went about their routines. But for Edward Sterling, the world had shifted into something unfamiliar. He was no longer the man who measured his hours by meetings and profits. He was the man who had seen one of his own employees nearly freeze to death on a park bench, and the image would not leave his mind. When he walked into the hospital again that morning, the nurses whispered behind the desk, some with curious eyes, some with disapproval. They had seen this scene before: wealthy men sitting beside those they had overlooked, suddenly desperate to make up for years of indifference. But Edward was blind to their glances. His eyes were fixed on the room, at the end of the corridor where Maria lay still, fragile but alive. Inside, Maria was propped up on pillows, the oxygen mask removed now, though her breaths were still shallow. A tray of untouched breakfast sat on the side table. She looked out the window, her dark hair loose around her face, the white hospital gown making her appear smaller, almost childlike. For a moment Edward stood in the doorway, unsure of how to enter, unsure of what to say. He was a man used to commanding rooms, to having voices lower when he walked in, to decisions being made on his word alone, but here, before this woman he had fired without a second thought, he felt clumsy, reduced like a student unworthy of his teacher's time. Maria turned when she sensed movement, her eyes weary but sharp. "You came back," she said softly, as though surprised. Edward nodded, stepping closer, his voice hesitant. "Yes, I had to." He sat down in the chair beside her bed, folding his hands together tightly to keep them from trembling. For a moment neither spoke, the silence between them stretching, filled only by the faint beeping of the monitor. Finally, Maria broke it. "You don't have to stay," she whispered, her voice rough from the cold she had endured. "You did what you had to, called for help. That's more than most would have done." Edward leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "No, Maria, that's not enough. Not for what I let happen." His words carried a weight she had not heard from him before, and her eyes narrowed with suspicion. She had worked in his mansion for years, and had never seen this side of him. To her, he had always been distant, cold, precise, a man who noticed the gleam of polished silver but not the tired hands that cleaned it. She looked at him now, as if trying to decide whether to believe this sudden change or to dismiss it as another performance by a rich man avoiding guilt. It was then that Edward asked the question that had haunted him all night. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. "Why didn't you tell me you were struggling, that you had nowhere else to go?" Maria blinked slowly, then turned her gaze back to the window. The winter sun filtered weakly through the glass, casting pale shadows across her face. Her lips pressed into a thin line before she finally spoke. "Because it wasn't your burden," she said quietly. "You hired me to clean your house, not to hand you my life story. You wouldn't have cared anyway." The words struck him like a blow, and she was right. He wouldn't have cared. If she had confessed her struggles weeks ago, he would have brushed them aside, telling himself it wasn't his problem. That was the kind of man he had been. He swallowed, hard, leaning back in the chair. "You're right," he admitted. "I wouldn't have listened, but I should have." Maria's eyes softened at his honesty, though her face still carried lines of pain. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she began to speak. Not about him, not about the mansion, but about her own life. She told him about the small town in Louisiana where she was born, about her mother's health collapsing after years of hard work in a textile mill, about her younger brother who had dreams of college but no means to pay for it. She had been the only one able to earn, so she came to the city, found work wherever she could, and eventually was hired into Edward's household. The money was never enough, but she sent nearly all of it back home. What little she kept barely covered food. Rent became impossible when her hours were cut. So she began sleeping in the laundry room, careful to wake before anyone saw her, careful to disappear into her uniform as though she had always come from outside. As she spoke, her voice trembled with exhaustion but carried a dignity that stunned Edward. She didn't tell her story as if asking for pity. She told it like a record of fact, as though her suffering was simply the price of survival, and the more she revealed, the heavier Edward felt inside. He had walked past that laundry room dozens of times, never once noticing the faint blanket, folded in the corner, the way she lingered near it at night. He had dismissed her lateness that one morning without a single question, throwing her out of the only shelter she had left. He had turned his back and it had nearly cost her life. When Maria's voice faltered, Edward found himself leaning forward, unable to stop the question rising in his chest. "Why didn't you ever say anything to me? Even once?" She looked at him then, her eyes steady and calm, carrying a quiet strength he had never seen. "Because people like you don't see people like me," she said. "You see the work, the results, the service, but you don't see the person. And I learned a long time ago that if I wanted to survive, I had to keep my head down, do the job, and not expect anyone to care." The silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable. Edward's chest tightened as her words echoed in his mind. "People like you don't see people like me." He wanted to argue, to say he wasn't like that, but he knew it would be a lie. He had been exactly that man. He had built an empire on invisibility, on workers whose names he didn't know, whose struggles he didn't care about, whose humanity he overlooked because they fit neatly into the machinery of his success. Maria had been one of them, and now she lay in a hospital bed because of it. Edward leaned back, his eyes closing, his breath unsteady. For years he had thought strength meant control, power, dominance. But listening to Maria, he realized true strength was something else entirely. It was enduring hardship in silence, carrying burdens without recognition, surviving even when the world turned away. Maria had been strong in ways he couldn't fathom, and he had dismissed her as if she were nothing. When he opened his eyes again, Maria was watching him, her gaze curious but cautious. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another, two people from different worlds, finally beginning to see each other. Edward's throat ached, his voice low when he finally spoke. "I failed you," he admitted, "and I don't know how to make it right." Maria looked away again, her hands fidgeting with the blanket. "Some things can't be fixed," she whispered. "Some things you just live with." But Edward refused to accept that. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about returns or risks or the easy path forward. He was thinking about Maria, her story, her suffering, her dignity, and he knew he couldn't simply walk away. Whether she wanted it or not, whether she believed him or not, he was going to change. Because if he didn't, then everything he had built, everything he had become, would mean nothing. That night, as Edward left the hospital, the air was still bitterly cold, but inside him burned a new fire. The truth about Maria's life had been revealed, and it had shattered the foundation of who he thought he was. He had seen her not as a maid, not as a worker, but as a human being. one stronger than he had ever been. And from that moment, he knew his life would never be measured in numbers again. It would be measured in people. Public exposure. The city never stayed quiet for long. News had a way of traveling faster than wind, and in winter, when stories carried the weight of survival, they traveled even faster. Edward had thought what happened in the park might remain private. Just an ambulance in the night, just a woman, saved from the snow, but the world was watching in ways he had not expected. A young jogger had been passing through the park that morning, earbuds in, breath fogging in the air, when he saw the figure on the bench. Out of habit, he had pulled out his phone and snapped a picture, not realizing until later that the image carried the kind of weight that could not be ignored. The photograph was simple. Maria curled on the bench in her navy uniform. Snow settled. Across her body, her face pale as frost, her apron dusted in white. She looked like a statue of sorrow, frozen in time. When the jogger posted it online, he captioned it with words that cut deep into the hearts of strangers. This is someone's mother, someone's daughter. How can a city of wealth let this happen? Noon, the image had spread like wildfire. Social feeds swarmed with outrage. News outlets picked it up and headlines screamed of injustice. Maid found freezing in wealthy district. The forgotten worker. Where was her employer? The photo appeared on television screens, in morning papers, on digital billboards. People demanded answers. They wanted to know how a woman in uniform, clearly tied to one of the wealthy homes in the city, had ended up nearly frozen on a park bench. They wanted someone to blame. And soon, the name of Edward Sterling appeared in the storm. His household was known, his wealth was public, and Maria's uniform bore the crest of his estate. Reporters camped outside his glass towers, microphones ready, shouting questions at anyone who came and went. Did Sterling know? Did he abandon her? How could a man worth millions let this happen under his own roof? Investors began to whisper. Board members began to call. The empire Edward had built on silence and efficiency was suddenly trembling, shaken by a story that revealed more about him than any balance sheet ever could. But while the city roared with judgment, Edward remained, where he felt he needed to be, in the hospital room at Maria's side. His phone buzzed endlessly with calls from his public relations team, urging him to make a statement, to control the narrative, to distance himself before the storm consumed him. But Edward did not answer. When one of his closest advisors stormed into the hospital waiting room demanding that he face the press, Edward looked at him with a calmness that startled even himself. "I don't need to talk," he said. "I need to act." That decision shocked everyone around him. For Edward Sterling, the man who had built his career on carefully crafted words and negotiations, silence was unheard of. But he knew words would mean nothing now. No apology drafted by lawyers, no speech written for cameras could erase the truth. Maria had nearly died because he had not seen her, and the world had seen what he had ignored. Only actions would matter now. And so, while the reporters shouted outside, Edward began to work in quiet ways. The first thing he did was ensure Maria's medical care would be fully covered, not as a charity case, not as a quiet payoff, but as a commitment. He personally signed the papers, instructing the hospital to send every bill to him directly, no matter the cost. Then, without waiting for permission, he arranged for Maria's mother and younger brother to be brought to the city. They were placed in an apartment nearby, fully furnished, fully paid, so Maria would no longer carry the crushing weight of separation. When her brother arrived, wide-eyed and nervous, Edward greeted him at the door and shook his hand firmly, saying only, "You're safe now." The staff at his mansion also began to feel the change. Edward returned one morning, gathered the cooks, the gardeners, the drivers, the maids who remained, and for the first time in his entire career as their employer, he spoke with something like humility. He told them the truth, that he had fired Maria without asking her story, that his lack of care had nearly cost her life. He told them he was sorry. The word itself seemed to echo in the marble halls like a sound the house had never heard before. Some staff lowered their heads in disbelief. One woman began to cry quietly. For the first time, They saw not the cold, commanding figure who paid their wages, but a man standing bare in his failure. The world, however, was not so forgiving. Journalists continued to circle, headlines continued to bite, and Edward's name became a symbol of privilege blinded by pride. Yet Edward no longer sought to fight the storm. He accepted it. He told himself that if the cost of redemption was the loss of reputation, then so be it. He had money, he had power, but neither meant anything if he could not answer to himself. Meanwhile, Maria slowly healed in her hospital bed. Each day she grew a little stronger, her skin regaining its warmth, her voice a little less frail. Edward visited daily, bringing books, flowers, even small meals he had asked the cooks at the mansion to prepare just the way she liked. At first she resisted, refusing to eat more than a bite, refusing to look him in the eye, refusing to believe his sudden kindness. But over time, something in her began to soften, not fully, not yet trust, but the faintest flicker of possibility that perhaps this man was changing. One evening, as Edward sat quietly reading in the chair by her bed, Maria spoke. "Why are you still here?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "The world is tearing you apart. Why don't you go save yourself?" Edward lowered the book, his eyes meeting hers with a steadiness she had never seen before. "Because saving myself means nothing if I don't save you first." The words hung in the room like a vow. Maria turned her face away, tears gathering despite her effort to hide them. For so long she had believed she was invisible, that people like Edward Sterling would never see her, never care, never remember her existence beyond the work she performed. And yet, here he was, every day, choosing her over the empire he had spent his life building. She did not yet know whether to forgive him, but for the first time she began to believe that perhaps he was not beyond redemption. Outside the hospital walls, the storm still raged, but inside that quiet room, a seed had been planted. A seed of change, of repentance, of a different kind of strength. Edward no longer saw Maria as a maid. He saw her as the mirror that revealed his own blindness. And he knew one thing with certainty. His story with Maria was only just beginning, and the world had not yet seen what would grow from this winter's coldest night. Second chances. The morning Maria was discharged from the hospital, the air outside was crisp, the snow glistening under a weak sun that seemed almost reluctant to warm the earth. She walked slowly, leaning on the arm of a nurse, her steps careful, her thin frame wrapped in a blanket that felt too heavy for her pride. She had not wanted to leave, not yet, because in the hospital she had a bed, a roof, a kind of security she had not known in months. But the bills would have been impossible, and she knew she could not stay. What she did not expect, however, was the sight that greeted her at the entrance. A black town car waited at the curb, polished and quiet, its driver standing by with the door open. And beside it, dressed in a navy suit that caught the morning light, stood Edward Sterling. His hands were clasped before him, and draped across his arm was a thick winter coat with a scarf neatly folded on top. Maria stopped in her tracks, her brows furrowing, suspicion tightening in her chest. She had not spoken to him much since. Her story spilled out in fragments days ago, and though he had visited daily, she had told herself it was guilt, not change, that bound him to her side. Now seeing him there as if waiting to escort her like she was someone of importance, her guard rose instantly. "I don't need your charity," she said softly, almost before he could open his mouth. Her voice was steady, though her body trembled in the cold. The nurse glanced awkwardly between them and then slipped away, leaving them standing in the thin winter sunlight. Edward stepped closer, holding out the coat but making no attempt to place it on her. His voice was calm, almost gentle, a tone she had never heard from him when she worked in his mansion. "This isn't charity," he said. "It's a correction. You should never have been out there in the first place." Maria's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes hard. She wanted to turn away, to walk past him, to prove that she needed no man to rescue her. But the truth of her body betrayed her. Her legs were weak, her chest still burned from the cold she had endured, and without shelter she had nowhere to go. She thought of her mother and brother, newly arrived in the city thanks to him, safe in an apartment she could not afford. Pride waged war with exhaustion, and she found herself frozen, unable to move forward or back. Edward held her gaze and then lowered his hand slightly, his voice steady. "Come stay in the guest wing of the house. Not as a servant, not as an employee. As a guest. Recover in warmth, heal in safety. And when you're ready, we'll talk about what comes next. Not what I expect from you. What you want." The words unsettled her. For years her life had been dictated by necessity. What others demanded, what survival required. No one had asked her what she wanted. The idea felt dangerous, almost frightening. She opened her mouth to protest again, but the truth pressed, hard against her pride. She could not walk away. Not this time, not with her family counting on her. So with a heavy breath she nodded once, sharp and reluctant, and allowed him to drape the coat around her shoulders. The warmth spread across her body like fire, and though she hated herself for it, her eyes stung with tears, she quickly blinked away. The ride to the mansion was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the faint hiss of tires on snow. Maria sat stiffly in the back seat, her hands clenched in her lap, her eyes fixed on the blur of the city passing by. Edward sat beside her, his posture straight, his expression unreadable, though his eyes flickered toward her more than once. He wanted to speak, to fill the silence, to bridge the gulf between them, but he understood enough now to know that silence was what she needed most. So he remained still, letting the quiet ride stretch between them like a fragile thread. When they arrived at the mansion, Maria hesitated at the gates. The sight of the sprawling stone estate brought a rush of memory, her moving quietly through its halls, invisible, efficient, unnoticed. She remembered hiding in the laundry room at night, pressing her body into the corner, praying no one would discover her secret. She remembered the morning he fired her, the look of irritation on his face as if her lateness had been an unforgivable offense. And now, to return not as a maid, but as a guest, felt unbearable. Edward seemed to sense her hesitation. He stepped from the car first, walking around to open her door himself. "It's not the same house anymore," he said softly. "Not for you. You'll see." His voice was quiet but firm, and something in his tone held conviction, as if he was making a promise not just to her, but to himself. Inside, the mansion looked as it always had. Gleaming marble floors, high ceilings, chandeliers glowing with soft light. But something felt different in the air. The staff moved quietly, not with the stiff fear of serving a master but with curiosity, their eyes flicking toward Maria as if trying to understand this new place she held. Edward guided her through the halls, not toward the servants' quarters, but up the grand staircase down a corridor she had polished countless times but never truly walked as her own. He opened the door to a sunlit guest suite, warm and inviting with a fireplace already glowing, a bed dressed in soft blankets, and a view of the gardens beyond. Maria froze in the doorway, her breath catching. Never in her life had she been invited into such a room. For a long moment she simply stood there, her body tense, her mind caught between awe and suspicion. Edward did not step inside. He remained at the door, his voice low. "This is yours for as long as you need it. No conditions, no obligations, just heal." Then he inclined his head slightly, almost like a bow, and stepped away, leaving her to the silence of the room. That night, Maria lay in the bed, the warmth enveloping her, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. She stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Her pride told her she should leave, that she should not depend on a man who had once cast her out without a thought. But her body told her another story. It told her of nights in the broom closet, of benches that froze her skin, of hunger that hollowed her belly, and it told her of her mother and brother, safe because of him. Slowly, her hand reached out to the blanket, clutching it as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. For the first time in years, she slept without fear. In the days that followed, Edward made a point of visiting, but never intruding. Each evening he would knock gently, bringing tea or small meals, asking softly how she was feeling, listening if she spoke but never pressing if she didn't. Sometimes she told him small pieces of her life, memories of her hometown, of walking, barefoot on dirt roads, of her brother's laughter, of her mother's cooking. Other times she said nothing at all and he accepted the silence, sitting quietly as if his presence was enough. For Edward, these evenings became the most important hours of his life. He had spent decades chasing numbers, chasing power, chasing everything except the thing he needed most, the ability to see another human being. Now, sitting across from Maria, listening to her stories, watching the light slowly return to her eyes, he felt himself changing in ways he could not yet name. Maria, however, remained cautious. She accepted his kindness but questioned it in her heart. She had seen wealthy men make gestures before, guilt offerings, charity cases, acts meant to polish reputations. She did not yet believe Edward was different. But as the days passed and he continued to come, not as a master, not as a savior, but simply as a man who listened, she began to wonder if perhaps his change was real. For both of them, the guest room became a place of quiet transformation. For Maria, it was a chance to breathe, to heal, to rediscover herself outside of survival. For Edward, it was a mirror forcing him to face what he had been, and a window showing him who he might become. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew the truth. What had begun as an accident in the snow was becoming something far greater. A second chance, not just for Maria's life, but for Edward's soul. Redemption. And change weeks turned into months, and the mansion no longer felt like the place Maria had once known. The marble floors still gleamed, the chandeliers still hung heavy with light, and the fireplaces still burned. But something in the air had shifted. Where silence once pressed against the walls like a weight, there was now a quiet rhythm of voices, footsteps, and even laughter that had never existed before. And at the center of that shift was Edward Sterling. He had always been a man of routine, every hour scheduled, every minute accounted for, every detail tied to profit. But now his routines bent in ways that startled everyone around him. Mornings, once dedicated to conference calls, were replaced by long conversations with his staff. He asked questions he had never asked before: how they were doing, what their families needed, whether the work weighed on them more than it should. At first, his employees were wary. They expected his sudden interest to fade, to be revealed, as another performance meant to soothe the scandal that had erupted when Maria's photograph spread across the city. But as days became weeks, they began to realize something astonishing. He wasn't pretending. He was listening. Truly listening. It was Maria who first saw the depth of his change. She had remained in the guest wing longer than she had planned, recovering her strength but also finding herself strangely unwilling to leave. Each evening Edward still came with tea or meals, sometimes carrying nothing more than questions. He asked about her life, her thoughts, even her ideas about work and people. At first she resisted, suspicious of why a man like him would care what she thought. But the more he asked, the more she spoke. And in speaking, she began to discover something she had long forgotten: that her voice had value, that her perspective mattered. One evening, after she told him a story about her younger brother working at a warehouse where the staff were underpaid and overlooked, Edward sat silently for a long time. Then, with a conviction that startled her, he said, "I want you to help me change that." Maria frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Edward leaned forward, his eyes steady. "I've spent my life building towers, contracts, fortunes, but I never built anything for the people inside those walls. I want to change the way my company works from the ground up. I want no one under my roof, whether at home or in business, to ever be invisible again. And I want you to lead that change." Maria blinked, stunned. "Me?" she whispered. "I was a maid. I cleaned floors." Edward shook his head firmly. "No, Maria. You survived when the world tried to break you. You carried your family when no one helped you. You saw things I refuse to see. That makes you stronger than anyone I know. I need someone who knows what it feels like to be unheard, unseen. Who better to protect them than someone who's lived it? At first, she refused. The weight of such responsibility felt impossible. She was used to scrubbing marble, not signing papers, used to silence, not leadership. But Edward persisted. He had seen something in her that she could not yet see in herself. And in the weeks that followed, he slowly built her trust by giving her small roles, meeting with staff, reviewing policies, sitting in on discussions about working conditions. To her surprise, the employees listened to her in ways they never had before. She was one of them, after all. She spoke their language, carried their scars, and soon her voice began to carry weight even in Edward's boardrooms. By spring, Edward made it official. In a quiet ceremony in the mansion, with only a handful of trusted staff present, he introduced Maria as the new director of employee welfare across all his properties. The title sounded grand, but what it truly meant was that she would be the heart of the company, the one ensuring that no one slipped through the cracks, that every voice was heard, that no worker would ever endure what she had. The moment was overwhelming. Maria stood in the same navy blue dress she had worn to the hospital chapel weeks before, her hands trembling, her heart racing. Edward stood beside her, his voice steady as he announced the role. "I have built skyscrapers and called myself powerful," he said. "But power without humanity is nothing. Maria Lopez showed me that. She taught me that the true measure of success is not in wealth, but in how we care for those who serve beside us. From today, she will lead us into a new chapter, one where no one is invisible." The staff rose to their feet in applause, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. Some had tears in their eyes. Maria herself felt her throat tighten as she looked out at faces that mirrored her own journey, faces of people who had long been overlooked, suddenly realizing they were finally seen. In the days that followed, Maria threw herself into the work. She visited every property, spoke with employees at every level, listened to their stories. She sat with janitors, drivers, clerks, and managers, her notebook filling with their struggles and ideas. And each evening she returned to Edward with pages of notes, her voice steady as she told him what needed to change. To his credit, Edward never dismissed her, never argued, never hid behind excuses. He acted. Policies were rewritten, wages adjusted, hours made fairer. For the first time in the company's long history, workers began to feel like they mattered. For Edward, this transformation was more than corporate reform. It was redemption. Each action he took, each policy he changed was a step toward repairing the damage of years spent blind. He no longer measured his life in profits or headlines. He measured it in the relief on a worker's face when their burden was eased, in the gratitude of a family given a chance to breathe, in the quiet strength of Maria standing beside him, no longer a maid, no longer invisible, but a leader who carried the dignity of countless voices on her shoulders. And though he never said it aloud, Edward knew the truth. This change was not his gift to her. It was her gift to him. Because in teaching him to see her, she had taught him to see the world, and he would never be the same again. Final transformation. The night of the gala arrived with the kind of anticipation that carried weight. The city's elite gathered in the grand ballroom of the Sterling Foundation, chandeliers dripping with light, the scent of roses filling the air, violins weaving soft music through the chatter. It was the kind of event Edward Sterling had hosted dozens of times before, an evening meant to dazzle, to impress investors, to polish the surface of wealth until it gleamed under cameras. But tonight was different. Tonight the ballroom was not only filled with polished gowns and expensive tuxedos, but also with workers, drivers, housekeepers, clerks, gardeners, cooks, people who had never been invited to stand under these chandeliers, who had never been treated as guests, only as shadows behind the curtain of luxury. Maria stood at the edge of the room, her hands folded in front of her, her navy dress simple but elegant. She looked around at the glittering crowd, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs. She had never belonged in such a place, not as a guest, not as a voice, and certainly not as someone the world had come to listen to. For years she had existed, in silence, cleaning spaces where she was unseen, walking hallways where her footsteps had been the only trace of her existence, and yet tonight she had been asked to stand on a stage, to speak to the same world that had once ignored her. Edward approached, his presence steady, his expression calm but his eyes bright with something close to pride. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. Maria let out a shaky breath. "No," she admitted honestly, "but I'll stand anyway." Edward smiled faintly, nodding. "That's all strength ever is." He offered his arm, not as a master, not as a savior, but as an equal, and together they stepped toward the stage. When Edward took the microphone, the room fell silent. The crowd expected the usual, grand words about profits, philanthropy, promises, wrapped in polished phrases. But his voice carried something raw, something unfamiliar even to those who had known him longest. "For years," he began, his deep voice echoing across the hall, "I believed power was measured in towers built and fortunes made. I believed success was control, efficiency, silence. And in that silence, I failed to see the people who stood beside me. I failed to see the hands that built those towers, the voices that remained unheard. One of those voices nearly died in the cold because I did not listen. Her name is Maria Lopez. And tonight, I want the world to see her as I finally do." He turned, extending his hand toward her. The spotlight shifted, and Maria stepped forward, her heart pounding as hundreds of eyes turned to her. For a moment she wanted to run, to hide, to disappear back into the safety of shadows. But then she remembered the nights in the broom closet, the mornings she polished marble with hands that ached, the bitter cold of the park bench, the snow pressing against her skin as she thought her life would end unseen. She remembered Edward's words in the hospital, "Because I should have been here long before today." And she knew this moment was not just for her, it was for every unseen worker, every invisible soul. The applause began slowly, a ripple across the room, then swelled into a roar. People rose to their feet not out of politeness but out of recognition, their faces reflecting something deeper than admiration, something like awe. Maria's throat tightened as she stepped to the microphone, her voice trembling at first but steadying with each word. "I am not here because of wealth or power," she said. "I am here because I survived when the world did not see me. I am here because someone finally chose to listen. And I stand not just for myself but for every person who has been invisible, who has been unheard, who has been made to feel that their work was all they were. Tonight, I tell you this. We are more than what we do. We are human, and we deserve to be seen." The room erupted again, the applause crashing like a wave, people shouting in support, tears shining in the eyes of those who had never expected to hear such words in such a place. For the first time in her life, Maria felt not like a servant, not like a shadow but like a flame, small but bright enough to be seen by all. Edward stood slightly behind her, his chest heavy, his eyes glistening. He had hosted countless galas, signed countless contracts, built countless towers, but never had he felt as powerful as he did in that moment, not because the world was clapping for him, but because he had finally understood that power meant nothing without humanity. He looked at Maria and he knew. She had given him back his soul. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond the ballroom. Newspapers wrote not of scandal, but of transformation. "The Maid Who Changed the Millionaire," one headline read. "From invisible to inspirational," read another. The photograph of Maria at the microphone, her eyes steady, her hands gripping the stand, became an image of hope across the city. Workers carried it, shared it, spoke of her as a symbol of dignity long denied. And Edward Sterling, once criticized as cold and indifferent, was now seen in a new light. Not because he had rescued her, but because he had allowed her to rise and shown the world her strength. Maria continued her work as Director of Employee Welfare, reshaping the company from the inside. She created programs for families, established funds for medical care, opened channels for voices to be heard. Slowly, the empire Edward had built shifted from a machine of profit to a community of people, and every decision, every reform, every change carried her imprint. For Maria, life would never be simple again, but it would be real. She still carried scars, still remembered the cold of that bench, but now she carried something stronger: dignity, respect, and the knowledge that she had turned her suffering into strength for others. For Edward, redemption was not a finish line but a path, one he would walk for the rest of his life, guided always by the woman he had once overlooked. And so the story closed where it had begun, in the silence of winter. The snow still fell on the city, coating the streets in white, but this time, Edward no longer walked past benches without looking. This time, Maria no longer sat alone in the cold. The millionaire and the maid, once divided by blindness and pride, now stood together, proof that even the coldest night could give birth to a dawn that changed everything. Because sometimes the people we ignore are the very ones who save us.